Welcome everyone to our second Open Pharma talk show on the future of pharma research communications. I'm Johan, project lead of Open Pharma, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Richard Smith, our talk show host. So Richard is chair of Open Pharma, and he also chairs the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, the Point of Care Foundation, and Patients Know Best. And he's also co-chair of the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. And many of you must know Richard from his time as editor of the BMJ, chief editor of the BMJ Publishing Group. And please feel free to participate, ask your questions through the Q&A function. And now over to Richard. Please enjoy it.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Joanna, and welcome everybody. So we're going to be discussing, is the current system of publication of pharma research fit for purpose? And that's the first question I'll put to each of our panels so they can prepare themselves. So I think most of you know about Open Pharma, although oddly enough, perhaps some of the panelists don't. So it was founded, 5, 6, 7 years ago to encourage the pharmaceutical industry to adopt more modern ways of publishing. As you'll know, about 50% of biomedical research is funded by the industry, and we felt that the industry was kind of lagging behind. And I think, unfortunately, it's still lagging behind. But this is an opportunity to discuss how far we've progressed. So this is the second of 2 talk shows. And in the first one, we asked, what does the world want from pharma research communications? And we had a patient representative, a policy maker, a man who described himself as a pharma provocateur, whatever exactly that is, for rethinking and realizing the huge unfulfilled potential of life sciences industry, and an academic researcher with a lot of experience of doing research in low and middle income countries. You can see that in on YouTube, but I'm just going to summarize just a few of the points that emerged. So when I put that question to the patient representative, she said, I want everything. She wanted full open access to the research with access to all the data. She wanted readable, plain language summaries in multiple forms, perhaps videos and podcasts and goodness knows what. And she wanted patients to be part of the research process from conception to publication and beyond, which is now quite normal in some parts of academic research. And then there were calls during the conversation for more trust, accessibility, and humanity in pharma research publications, and more inclusion of what didn't work and what went wrong. And people wanted less waste and repetition, more authenticity, which was thought to be a challenge for what was called a perfectionist industry, and that the pharma industry should be more daring, should communicate more openly about its difficulties. And there was a request for greater use of social media, although as we discovered, there's all kinds of regulatory issues with that. So we've got a pretty glittering panel here, and let me introduce them. So we've got Ashley Farley, who's got lots of experience of the library and publishing world, and she's now the Program Officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She leads the foundation's open access policies, and particularly Gates Open Research. And then we've got Johan Rooryck, who's a linguistician by background. I wasn't sure whether you were a linguist or a linguistician. Went for linguistician, you can tell me later. And he's executive director of Coalition S, and he's the editor-in-chief of the Diamond Open Access journal Glossa, a journal of general linguistics. I think more because of my medical training than my classics training, I'm pretty sure that glossa means tongue. And he was the executive editor of Lingua, which was published by Elsevier, but he left in a huff, I imagine, to found Glossa. He's a founding member and president of the Fair Open Access Alliance. Then Christine Laine is a physician and clinical epidemiologist, and she's now the editor-in-chief of Annals of Internal Medicine. She's also a professor of medicine at the Sydney Kimmel Medical College, where she cares for patients and teaches. And she's been very prominent in the International Committee of Medical Editors, the World Association of Medical Editors, and the Council of Science Editors. And then we have Richard Horton, who's also a physician by background, but a bit like me, not much of one. And he's been the editor-in-chief of the Lancet for many years, and I think has made it the leading journal in global health and a great campaigning journal with its many commissions and campaigns. He's won many prizes, including the WHO Director General's Health Leaders Award for Outstanding Leadership in Global Health and the Rooryck Prize for Outstanding Leadership in recognition of innovation in the application of global health evidence. I was at that, where he got awarded that. It was a hell of a dinner, fantastic drink and food. And I must say, I always think of Richard as the reincarnation of Thomas Wackley, who was the founder and great campaigning editor of the Lancet, who was so campaigning he had his house burnt down. I don't think that's happened to Richard. Right, we want to run this more like a talk show and less like a panel. I'll try to keep order, but people can jump in and address each other. It's all being recorded, as you heard, and it's available on YouTube. There's also going to be a discussion afterwards for an hour for those of you who can stay. We've had questions submitted, which I've got in front of me, but we encourage people to submit questions on comments using the chat function, especially when we get things badly wrong. So I'm going to start with a broad question before we dig into the details. So Ashley, I'm going to kick off with you. Is the
fantastic
system of publication of pharma research fit for purpose? And you don't say yes or no, you've got to say a bit more than that.
Well, I think I would start with no, and I would say in general, I feel like the way that we currently use academic publishing is not fit for a lot of different disciplines. I think we're very much kind of stuck in the print legacy era, and would love to see a lot more innovation that really brings us, I think, further into where we are with technology. And that's one of the reasons why I love Gates Open Research. I think it's a platform that leverages the kind of technologies that we have available. I think, yeah, we need a major refresh to be able to share information much more quickly and much more reusable, more dynamic ways that have a quicker, better impact in the space.
So Ashley, could you just say a quick bit about how Gates Open Research is different from the
I think it's really centered on author kind of driven. Like when authors are ready and want to share something, we don't reject things based off scope or novelty. That doesn't mean that it doesn't go through the typical kind of plagiarism, scientific soundness checks, and then it's available in more of a preprint form. But instead of being able to be submitted elsewhere, it stays on the platform to go through fully open peer review. And I know that's a whole separate topic in of itself, but I'm a major proponent of fully open peer review. And then the other kind of technological component I think is really important is versioning control. So when things need to be updated, changed, reviewer comments need to be addressed, all of that is outlined to the reader. And especially when I think we consider the communities we're trying to reach, and you're thinking about patients and other more general people wanting to read and understand this information, as they see more of how the scientific process and how articles actually improve, so that process is very opaque and kind of behind closed doors right now. I think it helps inform people and how the conversation and research changes and improves throughout the process of publishing, and that's important to highlight. So all of that is well spelled out.
Okay, so Christine, you're the editor of a traditional journal. Do you agree with all of that?
No, I don't, because I mean, first of all, the journal that I edit has a very directed audience. We're the journal for the largest specialty organization, physician specialty organization, at least in the US. And we can't, so our readership goes way beyond the members of the American College of Physicians, but we're very much focused on our clinician readers. And the content we produce is for our clinician readers. And my sense is, in translating research, there's a flow, and it goes for the researchers to talk directly to the patients I think that there are some problems there because the research needs to be vetted. And I think that open peer review sounds better than it works. And I think that it's because at least at Annals, our external peer reviewers are very important, but the internal journal process with clinical and methodologic experts, we publish almost nothing in the form that it comes in. And you know, we're removing spin, we're removing exaggeration, we're asking for appropriate analyses that are using standard methods. And you know, the journal is more accountable than an external peer reviewer who's going to post a few comments and is not ultimately accountable for the accuracy and the trustworthiness of the material in the end, whereas a journal is, at least good journals like Lancet and Annals are. So I think that, you know, there's a translation process. The researchers do the research, it goes through peer review, then it's fed to the clinicians, and the role of the clinicians is to help patients understand that research. And there are some patients who are very sophisticated and can translate that research, but most patients, even very well-educated ones, it needs to go through the lens of the clinician to, I think, to serve patients best. So, you know, some of the things that Ashley mentioned, I think traditional journals are doing. We publish things in multiple formats. We publish things online as soon as they're ready to be published. We do podcasts, we have social media posts, we have videos by our authors, videos created by our editors. So we are taking, there's still a print journal, but almost everything in the print journal has been available on the journal website for, you know, well before it appears in the print journal. And the reason we have the print journal is because our readers tell us they want it. I predicted when I became the editor that within 5 years of me being the editor, print would be gone. I was wrong. But so
Christine, can I ask you, do you worry that you're sound a bit old-fashioned and a bit out of step with the times when you say, you know, patients can't have access, don't need access to research?
No, I think patients
translated for them.
Patients, I'm not saying that patients shouldn't have access to research, but I think they do need help in determining whether or not it's appropriate, you know, appropriate for them and how it fits into their care with in the context of other things that we know about the condition and other therapies and other health issues that particular patient has. You know, it would be, I mean, if patients, we wouldn't need clinicians if patients could just take the research and enact it on their own. So, but again, I'm biased. I'm a clinician. I still see patients.
Yeah. I don't think anybody's disputing we need clinicians. I don't think people are going to be removing their own kidneys or anything.
Oh, well, no, I think there's going to be Dr. Chatbot.
Yeah. Well on the way. So, Johan, what do you think?
Well, I am somewhere in between these two positions. I mean, I'm an editor myself of a journal in linguistics, and that's Ashley would still see that as a traditional journal, and it is to some extent. It does double-blind peer review. It publishes papers after the peer review, and I agree with Christine that the peer review process really improves papers. I mean, that's what you do as an editor. I think as an editor, you sort of manage interests. You manage the interests of the reviewers, of the author, of the field, and you try to improve the paper if that paper is improvable. I disagree with Christine probably because I think that those elements of the peer review process, the tradition, can be transferred directly to the system that Ashley is proposing with Gates Open Research, and this idea of publish, review, curate, which is entirely compatible, I think, with the more traditional workflows that we know and love. At the same time, I think it's going to take time for these new workflows and these new systems to establish themselves and to be appreciated fully by the academic community. And so in the meantime, I think it's more important that we have mandates for open access everywhere. So both in, let's say, the new systems that provide that immediately and that have much more that immediate effect, but also with the old system. So insist on the fact that all research should be open at the source. When it is published, it should be open access. So when you say that in pharmaceutical research, I mean, a lot of the research is not yet open, I think that's the first problem to address. And then subsequently, we can address the other problems of giving people more access and earlier access to research. But the first thing should be, like Coalition S has done, create a mandate for open access research. Say all the research, like we did, all research funded by Coalition S must be published in open access in any way, shape, or form, whether it's green, any color of open access, but it has to be a published open access. That's the first thing. And why is that important? It's important not just for the public, not just for the citizens, but also for all these researchers in the global south. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands researchers in the global south who don't have access to this research. And I always say, you never know where the next good idea is going to come from. I mean, you don't know whether those people in India, in South America, are going to find the next cure for you name it. And
is it really true that people in those countries don't have access?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Yes, yes.
Well, I think it depends on
many types of research. Many types of research. Yeah.
I think it depends. It depends on the journal.
Because I know
that the people in low and middle income countries have access if they go through
jump through a bunch of
hoops that are providing that access. Yes, they have access.
But Hinari, I mean, and all these initiatives are very spotty. I mean, they give access to certain countries, not to others. I mean, we need something that is much more radical than these initiatives, which are spotty and which really depend also on the goodwill of the publishers, which is something that I don't believe in. I really think we should have open access at the source. That should be the default. And
I wish we all had the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation behind us.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, Johan. I mean, actually, I live in London, which is, well, it was a high-income country. It's rapidly going down. Things I don't have access to. I have to ask my friends to get access for me. So, Johan, can you tell us roughly how many public funders like Gates, Wellcome, NIH have got mandates for open access? Because I think we know, unfortunately, that there's only a handful, maybe only 2 pharmaceutical companies that do, although I think it's also true that a lot of their research...
Well, I think, I mean, in Coalition S, we have...
Also, we're a private funder.
Yeah. Yes, well, Coalition S is 28 funders total. National, there's about, I think, 23.
Can we define open access? Because open access includes CC/BY licenses. They can be repurposed even for commercial purposes, just with attribution. So it involves rights. Yes. I should clarify something, that a lot of that Annals does not do open access, but we do public access, which means there's no barrier to somebody going to our site. People can't use it without getting permission and assuring rights. So
I would already settle for public access, but
right. Let me give Richard a chance.
We at Coalition S, we require open access in the more traditional sense. So with the CC/BY license that allows for reuse, right? That's what we demand.
I'm going to come back to that CC/BY thing in a minute, but firstly, I want to give Richard a chance. So here is the reincarnated Thomas Wackley, famous for his radical position, but also the editor of a very traditional journal. So what do you think, Richard?
Well, we should thank the pandemic, shouldn't we? Because the pandemic made us all behave in a completely different way. Everything was made freely accessible for the last 3 years with having anything to do with COVID, and that should be the norm. Because why should we do that just with the COVID-19? We've got epidemics all over the world of non-communicable diseases? Why do we draw the line with a pandemic and NCDs or anything else? So I think the pandemic forced editors and publishers to think quite differently about how to deal with acute health problems. The question you asked at the beginning, I don't know whether we're still answering that.
Yeah, you still are, Richard.
We are, okay.
Anything you want, you know.
About pharma.
Who am I to control you?
I mean, I would say no, it's not fit for purpose, but with some caveats. And the reason why I think it's not fit for purpose, let me just sort of the chain of argument here. One thing that we've definitely learned from the past 3 years is that we live in an age of misinformation. And I was looking at some data this morning from Retraction Watch, and the number of retractions that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years, it's going up. I mean, the bar charts look almost exponential. It's frightening, actually. And maybe that's ascertainment bias because we're all doing our jobs brilliantly well now. So we're taking papers out of the system. Whatever, it doesn't look great. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so one of the, certainly for editors anyway, one of our tasks has got to be, how do we make sure that we build public and policy and political confidence in the research that we publish? Because there's at least to my mind, there's a sufficient jeopardy in confidence in research that the whole edifice could come toppling down, especially if Trump gets in again in 2024. So
we can't utter that.
If that's the case, look, Bill Gates can do anything. So I'm waiting for him to decide if he's going to make sure that Trump gets in or not. If that's true, that we live in an age of misinformation and we have some responsibility to build confidence and trust in science, and then we think about the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical research we publish, this is where I do have some concerns. The papers that I see at our twice-weekly manuscript meeting, the number of pharma-sponsored trials where the drug company has designed the study, collected the data, done the analysis, written the paper, in that little section in the paper on the role of the funding source, you wonder what the hell the authors, the supposed academic authors, have actually done, because it appears that all they've done is they've allowed their names to be stuck on the byline of the paper, while the rest of the paper has just become a piece of marketing for the company. Now, that has been standard practice for the last 30 or 40 years in medical publishing. We've all lived with it. We've all complained about it. But I think we're getting to a point now where misinformation is such a threat to the credibility and reputation of science that we need to clean our act up. And so for me, the big issue is credibility, trust in science, and how to defeat the age of misinformation.
So, Richard, I don't know whether you saw the piece that appeared in The Economist yesterday suggesting 10% of all published research is false, which of course is building on research that goes back 40 years. So I think you're absolutely right. But how many of the randomized trials you publish in the Lancet are from the pharmaceutical industry? And do you think about research from the pharmaceutical industry differently from how you think about other research?
Well, we don't think about it differently, but what we see is different. I mean, we probably publish, I mean, it's changed in the last 3 years with COVID, but normally in the pre-COVID times, we were publishing about 50-60% of research papers in the Weekly Lancet were randomized trials. And of those, I would say about 3/4 were some sort of pharmaceutical industry sponsorship. And we do publish global health trials where they've been funded by other organizations, such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And you don't see the same level of intrusion. You don't, in the role of the funding source, it doesn't say the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation designed the study, collected the data, analyzed the data, and wrote the paper. But you do see that almost routinely in pharma-sponsored studies. So there is a qualitative difference in terms of the role of the sponsor in intruding itself into the positioning of a paper. And that's where Christine is so right, that literally every sentence of a paper gets rewritten at the Lancet, as I'm sure it does at Annals, because you're de-spinning it. So that
So you are publishing it, Richard. I thought from the way you describe it, you thought, well, we don't want that paper.
But these are, I mean, this is why I say no with caveats, because
You don't want them in the version that they were submitted.
and look, let's not be nihilistic about it.
So how can you unspin it once they've done the research?
Well, hang on. Let's not be nihilistic about the fact that the pharmaceutical industry does deliver life-saving and life-changing products for which our healthcare system should be and largely is deeply grateful. I know from personal experience that people can be kept alive with modern pharmaceuticals, which a matter of 10 years ago, they could not. So I am deeply grateful to the investments that the pharmaceutical industry has made in all kinds of different medicines. So that's why I say no with caveats. What you can do is you can make sure that, I mean, this is simple stuff, but it's important that all the endpoints that are in the protocol are reported fully in the trial, that there isn't selective reporting, that a secondary endpoint that gives a positive result isn't included in the abstract when the primary endpoint is null. These kinds of things, you know, discussion of limitations of the research, all of those things to give a more fair and balanced and accurate account of the research than maybe the original paper that was written by a medical communications company hired by the sponsor. So that to me is the biggest issue. I mean, I accept that open access is an important issue, but actually I think seriously, misinformation right now is a really, really big issue, and let's not ignore it.
Although, you know, my sense is, you know, the question is about pharmaceutical research, but I think you can ask that about any research. Is it fit for purpose? Because, I mean, in the US, there's misinformation that comes from, you know, government-funded studies or academic institution-funded studies. And I'm sorry, the sunlight is coming in to the room. And there's spin in paper. I mean, authors can be guilty of spin even when they don't have a direct financial interest in the outcome. So I think that some of these issues are not just the pharmaceutical industry, although, you know, Richard's point about the fact that the individuals who are doing the study have much, you know, more of a direct financial interest in the outcome. But, you know, there are.
I think I'm right in saying that if you look at retractions in relation to impact factor, the higher the impact factor, the more retractions. So it's not as if misinformation is in your journals too. I mean,
Yes,
you're publishing truths, are you? You're publishing provisional truths, many of which turn out to be misleading.
Everything is provisional truth because there's advances that make what we published 10 years ago no longer true.
Yeah. Can I just pick up to come back to this CCBY issue? Because this
Wait, can I?
Yeah, come on, Ashley.
I'm going to come in. Sorry, I just want to say a few things before we change topics. And I think, you know, it's interesting to hear the misinformation come up, but there's 2 points I'd like to make. And I think it's looking at the root cause for the motivation, and that's trying to get papers into so-called, you know, high impact journals to make sure that careers are advanced. So there is a financial incentive there. And so I think, you know, a lot of the cultures, especially around academia, it can produce a need to put spin on things so that they get published, where a lot of authors think that they need to get published in order to advance their career. So changing that, I think, is an imperative in helping to get rid of that issue. And then I would ask, and I would say myself, I don't think the traditional publishing system is set up in a way that can handle misinformation. And if others agree, then what would we need to change in order to tackle that? Because I think the fact that it's very opaque and slow are 2 ways that, you know, misinformation can crop up and spread so much quicker.
Yes, this is why.
I mean, what in particular? I mean,
I think
yeah.
I mean, what are we doing?
For instance, in terms of fit for purpose, one of the things that I think you would you would want in a fit for purpose publication system is for readers to be able to comment directly to the articles. I mean, that is something that
We do that at
so
Annals.
it's something that is implementable, but that can help with misinformation, because I mean, the more people can read and read the articles and comment on them, the more you get, you know, you can correct the record in real time.
Anybody can post a comment on a published Annals article, and we post it
Yeah, but
within
no, that's not
48
the case
hours.
in all. That's not the case in all journals and in all.
Yeah,
and on all
no,
platforms.
but you're right. There is value in that, although you have to be careful, because some of the comments are communicating misinformation.
Yeah,
so
of course.
Can I just comment here? It's a nice idea, and I'd love to believe it, but it's actually not true that we live in a marketplace of ideas, and that the way you can push out bad ideas is by just publishing more good ideas. That's not the way the internet works, and there's huge amounts of documented research about this. The problem with social networks is that as soon as you introduce a bad idea into a community where there are different levels of trust, you immediately get polarization. And as soon as you get polarization into different communities believing different things, it's almost impossible to break that polarization down and apart. So just by publishing more information that you think is true, that doesn't actually deal with.
How would you manage that?
So that's the challenge. That's the challenge that we have to work on. I don't have a simple answer to that, but I do believe
we can agree that Twitter is not the answer.
I do believe that we as editors have an absolutely key role in making sure that the information we do publish can be as free of misinformation as possible. Sometimes we get it wrong, sometimes we get it right, but we absolutely have a key role. And I completely disagree that this so-called traditional publishing, which doesn't exist, there's no such thing as the traditional and the non-traditional publishing system. There is a publishing system. And the idea that the traditional publishing system can't do this, I mean, it's just nonsense. We do it every single day. And actually, you're invited to come to the Lancet anytime you like to meet any of our editors, and you will see that they do this every single day. So for you to sit there and say that we can't do it, I'm sorry, it's just, you know, the door is open to you. Come next week.
You brought up the concern about misinformation, and
no, but you were the one who said that the traditional publishing system can't do it. And I'm saying, come and have a look, because we do it every day.
So Richard, I've heard you in the past say that maybe it's not true now, but it was true. The Lancet made more money out of pharmaceutical reprints, most of which are purchased by pharmaceutical companies, than out of anything else. Does that not worry people that somehow you're too beholden to the pharmaceutical industry? You said 2/3 of your RCTs are funded by the industry.
Well, thankfully, that's not the case anymore. That's certainly true. That's certainly about 20 years ago. But with various changes to legislation and regulating the way drug companies can market their products now, the money that's made on reprints is actually a declining revenue stream. So we still make, if you look at the Lancet's, where the Lancet makes money from, most of the money we make is still amazingly from subscription journals. An dramatically increasing amount of revenue comes from open access journals, and a declining amount of revenue comes from the advertising and reprints. So I'm much less worried now than I was about our dependence on industry funding. I'm actually more worried about the perverse effects of open access. Because what open access has done, it's opened a door for publishers to see a quick way of making a lot of money. And I'm not just talking about predatory publishers here. This is being done in with all publishers. They're moving their business models from subscription-based to open access-based. The argument on open access has been won. No contest on that.
Yeah, there's no going backwards.
No, there's no going back. Everybody's fine with that. So now, we're not fighting that fight anymore. Now it's a race, and it's a race for market share. And so what all the traditional publishers are doing is trying to win market share. and that's a volume game. It's not in the old days with subscriptions, it wasn't a volume game, it was a quality game. And now
this is going to undermine traditional publishing. You're going to be piling them high, publishing them cheap in order to capture.
That's the danger. And so for an organization like the Lancet, I am trying to close the door, and so that we don't get drawn into the incentive of just making money by publishing vast numbers of papers. Yeah. That's what PLOS One did. That's what MDPI are doing, and it is going to kill quality. And the danger is, I come back to my point about misinformation. You're going to see, this is one of my concerns. You're going to see paper mills in China driving all this total fabricated research that will drive up retractions, destroy the credibility in science, and the whole edifice will come crashing down.
Come back to, because following away from reprints. Can I just pick up, Christine, on the CCBY thing, because this is a source of grief to the pharmaceutical industry, because they find that whereas Gates and Wellcome can publish with everything available, they can't. And I think a lot of people believe that's because you're saving it you're reserving it in order to make money out of reprints. Why do you not publish CCBY, pharmaceutical company research?
What is that question for me?
Yeah.
We don't publish any CCBY research. And the other thing that, I mean,
and why not? Why not?
It's not our model. We're a subscription-based journal so I view journals in the open access world as there are two types. The subscription journals are like the galleries at a museum. We curate our content and we try to deliver it to the audience who we think needs it and is most interested in it. Whereas an open access journal is like the storeroom at a museum. Everything is in there. People can get it, but they have to come there to get it and be looking for it to find it. Whereas journals like Annals and Lancet, we think we know who our main audience is, and we curate the content and we publish it in conjunction with other things that are going to deliver it. And we also spend, the one thing that article processing charges does not cover is the dissemination of the research. So the creation of podcasts and alerts and sending the material, the stuff that we publish out to people, because what we know is that, we can have public access articles sitting on the website, and if we are not pushing them out to the audiences that we think want to see them, they get much lower usage than if we think that an article, it really needs to be brought to the attention of a cardiologist, and we push it out to cardiologists, it gets much higher. So I think that there is a place, my sense is there's going to be a place for both types of journals, sort of the archive journals. The stuff is there, anybody can go and get it, but they're going to they need to go and find it. And then the journals that are more like a museum gallery, it's curated content for a particular audience. And I think there's a place for both journals. I think there will be more of the open access journals and fewer of the reader focused journals. I think the challenge is going to be, I'm not sure what the funding model for the reader focused journals is going to be. You really need most Annals resources come mostly from membership from our members. But if the content in our journal is all free to people, one of the benefits of being a membership of the organization goes away. So revenue.
Yeah, and I can tell you as an editor of the BMJ, I mean, luckily it didn't happen to us, but once you start having to take money from the people who own you, you're buggered. And things get really grim.
It depends on who owns you.
Well, I'm not sure it does, to be honest. But
this is also why,
Richard, just with the Lancet's line on CCBY.
Well, it's a good question. We're in a transition phase at the moment. So what our publishers say to us is that we have to get to a place where it's sort of a sustainable business model. So we do publish open access papers in the weekly journal. You know, we have other open access journals, but we publish open access papers in the weekly journal. We're just trying to decide when the right moment is to press the button that switches us to full open access.
Yeah.
We just haven't got there yet.
One
get there.
problem with
It
the
might be this
CCB
year, it might be next year, but it's coming soon, I'm sure.
So
And you're
issue that-
200 years old this year, so that's
This would be a good year to do it,
Lancet on
wouldn't it?
that.
So Richard, one thing that worries me about the CCBY is the reuse with just attribution. And even though we don't do that, we do, if people are reusing a figure that's in Annals with modification, they have to get permission. And just yesterday, there was somebody was asking to reuse a figure in Annals that they modified, and they modified it by using a different scale, removing error bars, removing the numbers of patients, you know, in each group.
But
And
in,
it looked much more, I mean, it was misinformation the
But-
modified way. And since we have rights to that, we can protect the misuse of that author's work.
but
Um,
under CCBY, Christine, you have to indicate whether you change and how you have changed.
But-
So
but wait,
that
but-
is that is
But
that,
you can
that is
still,
not a
but you
problem
can
of
still
CCBY.
change. There isn't, you don't have to get permission to change.
You don't have to get permission, but
Right, so
but if you
that
don't,
figure,
but
that
if
was
you,
misleading
but that's a
could
problem you
be-
always have. If somebody does this without asking for your permission, you also have the problem. I mean, there's nothing that can protect you to me with respect to misuse, right? Abuse can happen everywhere, whether you have.
well,
you
it
have
can
copyright or whether it's
happen,
under
but
CCBY.
if you found it, so for example, if there was a CCBY and that entity took that figure, presented it in a way that really exaggerated the benefits of the intervention, because if you looked at it, it looked, you know, you didn't know that there were hardly any patients, you didn't see the error bars, the scale was magnifying the results, and that was posted on social media, that's misinformation. We were able to say, you can't do that. If somebody had just done that and we saw that, and the authors of that paper saw that and came to us, we could intervene and say.
But Christine, isn't this a bit like
Yeah,
trying to control the tide or the west wind? I mean,
it is.
published.
It
I mean,
is.
everything spreads everywhere and is.
It is,
What
but
I'm saying is
because
this
there
is
is-
not the problem of CCBY. It's a problem of misuse in general.
But the
It's-
which is very
CCBY
common.
makes it easier to do that.
Let's move on.
No, it's less enforceable. That's true. I mean, you can enforce it because you have copyright and your publisher can go after the authors. That's less
Yeah, but
easy.
I wonder how often that happens. I mean,
If
unless
it's,
you're
I
Disney
mean, if
or
it doesn't
something.
matter, then why do we need open access or other journals? People can just do their research, post it on their institutional website. If people want to comment on it, they can. Anybody can get it, and we all go away.
No, no.
Yeah, that's
Well,
a
that's-
good question. That's maybe the one we'll
Yeah.
finish with. So let's move on to. I mean, Ashley talked about a different model of peer review at Gates Open Research. Johan, do you think we should be modifying, experimenting with different ways of peer review?
Yes, I definitely think that, well, with different ways of peer review, I don't know whether we should modify peer review in itself. I do think we should definitely pay more attention to open peer review. I think that's the next frontier. It's very difficult to sell that to researchers, I find. I mean, to have people sign their, have their reviews more open and or sign them. I mean, I think that is problematic in various respects, but we should at least have a discussion about it. One of the things that I'm concerned with open peer review, for instance, is the power differentials that you have between authors and reviewers. This is something that needs to be managed very carefully. And it is something that reformers of publishing very often don't pay attention to, because one of the things I find very frustrating in all this talk about publishing reform is that the last people who are asked about this are editors themselves. We are always, last in line when people make these reforms. Whereas these are exactly the kinds of things that we are trying to manage, right? I mean, power differentials between reviewers, authors. I mean, you know, you have an older author, younger reviewers. I mean, they meet. I mean, they are bound to meet each other down the line, and you have to manage those kind of potential conflicts. So this is something you have to think about in that debate. But do I think that peer review should be open? Yes, I think that should be the case, because I think it gives more access to the discussion, to the actual discussion that is going on. Do we need to be careful about it? Yes, we need to be careful about it. So I think there's room for, but I do think, like Christine and like Richard, I do think there's room for an entire range of options. I mean, I think there's room for the options that in publishing that Ashley is defending, and I think there's room for traditional journals, and there's room for curation journals, and they may and certainly journals that have a curation model are probably, like Christine says, in a very different situation than journals that publish original peer-reviewed research. This is also something that we have taken into account in Plan S, for instance, in the sense that we really focus on peer-reviewed articles, and curated content, for instance, is something that falls outside of the scope of Plan S.
Let me ask Richard. I mean,
although when I'm saying we curate the research content too,
yes,
so
yes.
it's not that
we're
not.
There's an additional layer.
Let me ask, because famously the peer review system at the Lancet, described by its great editor Robbie Fox, is you stand at the top of the stairs and you throw them down the stairs, and the ones that get to the bottom are published. Is that still the method you use, Richard? And are you thinking of revising it?
Well, I was very disappointed when I came to the Lancet, because I'd imagine that I'd be sitting in an armchair with a glass of claret in one hand and a cigar in the other, and just tossing manuscripts into a waste paper bin and choosing. And then I discovered we had to do this annoying thing called peer review. Honestly, all these discussions about different types of peer review, I really couldn't care less. In my little corner of the world, which is medicine and public health, these are not the most important issues. The most important issues are that the vast amount of evidence that has been accrued by the world is not implemented. So the public are not.
But wait a minute, Richard. Okay, that's true.
Hang on. You're the one talking about misinformation. You're going to let me finish. You're going to let me finish.
And isn't peer review...
Look, life is short. I've got limited time to do what I want to do. All right. So I couldn't give a toss about open peer review. The only things that matter to me are, number one, that the evidence I publish is ignored, and number two, health. We live in a world of health disparities. So I want our journal to be campaigning, activist, advocating for research translation and implementation, and for health equity. And whether we have open peer review, closed peer review, blind peer review, double-blind peer review, seriously, is that the most important issue in my?
But isn't it important, because you're the one making a big thing about misinformation? It isn't your claim.
Yeah,
it's in the Lancet. It's
but I don't think whether I have open peer review or closed peer review matters a damn for the quality of information. What matters is I've got a team of 40 editors behind me who are rewriting every single line, checking every single number, redrawing every single figure, going back to the authors and double checking and triple checking and quadruple checking everything to make sure there's no misinformation. And then once we've published it,
so actually you could dispense with the peer review then.
What?
Dispense with the peer review. So you're saying value comes from what your editors
dispense with it, but all these discussions, which have been going on for years and years, 20 years of peer review congresses with randomized trials on open and closed peer review. I mean, seriously? Is that really the most important thing in the world?
Well, I suppose you could argue it's important because most of the evidence suggests that peer review doesn't achieve anything. That it's actually
except that we know it does. Except that we know that peer review does achieve something, because we are rewriting papers.
Let's go back to. We've got just 10 minutes more. Let's go back to patients, because here in Britain, if you apply for a grant to the National Institute for Health Research, they will want to know that patients are involved in every part of the research, in the design of the research, the carrying it out, and then eventually the peer reviewing of it and the interpreting of it. Do you think that's what should be happening routinely, Ashley?
Yes.
So are you
So-
doing anything about that at Gates?
Yeah. Sorry, I was reading some of these questions in.
Yeah, I'm not seeing them for some
In the
reason.
Q&A.
There's some really great questions, and I love.
Well, why don't you pick out one, Ashley?
So I think this ties into what we're talking about now. Well, I like the topic of misinformation and bringing up what is the role for patient organizations in the context of combating misinformation and getting research practice and combating health inequities. And I think that's a really good question and point to bring up, because it's a good that we don't have necessarily always a direct pipeline of the research to the patient. So what are those advocacy groups, again, or similar to what Christine was saying around clinicians, is having, somebody, I'm a librarian, that's my perspective that I come with, of having somebody who can help you along kind of the information journey and make those translations for you. And I think that is also, probably one of the largest stopgap measures we can have for misinformation getting out into the general public.
Christine, can I ask you about the role of patients in research? Is this something you encourage at the Annals?
I mean, increasingly
reviewers?
funders are requiring it. We will publish research that has not included patients in it. We recently participated in a study that one of our associate editors had some NIH funding to train a group of patients to be peer reviewers, and they were heavily coached by somebody who was a research methodologist, clinician, to do those peer reviews. And we had the patient peer reviews at our manuscript conference. There was a finite set of patient peer reviewers, and the topics were all chronic kidney disease, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. So it was like limited to the scope of the clinical conditions. And to be quite frank, I mean, we looked at those comments, the patients gave almost the same comments every time. And these are not necessarily patients who had the condition, and the comments just weren't that helpful, to tell you the truth. So I think that there is value in saying that you had patient reviewers, but the patients weren't really changing they weren't contributing comments that were changing the presentation of that research. They were often tangential comments like, okay, but how, I mean, that were valid, but they were about other things, like I'm trying to think of an example, but it was talking about something else for that. They weren't really focused on that particular research question. So, the results have not, there were several journals that were involved in those studies. Those results haven't been published. So what I'm saying is just anecdotal. I didn't see that we were really, the thing that we would be adding is saying that we had patient reviewers. I don't know that it was really changing the quality of the peer review. I would like to be proved wrong. So that was our experience. And
So
we
Richard,
do publish summaries for patients of selected articles.
And how do you select the ones you publish summaries of?
The things that we think are going to be of widest interest, any clinical guideline, and they're very hard to write. And we did an experiment where we had the authors writing them, and that was a disaster, because talk about spin and inability to use plain language. So, they're very intensive to write. So we would pick topics that were of interest to a broad audience.
Okay, we've got just 5 minutes left. A question I'd like to pick up on is something Ashley raised right at the beginning, and it's a question we got in advance. Can academia move away from the performance-based research funding systems that give prominence to journal impact factor? So, Richard, what about that? Do you think we should move away?
I'd love to. Yeah, no, I mean, there was a time, this is going back a long time now, 20 years, and we introduced a new section in the weekly Lancet, which was trying to expand the amount of material we published, early research. And I didn't think about the impact it would have on our impact factor, and our impact factor dropped like a stone a few years after we did that, and I got into terrible trouble for it. And so we had to stop the feature because impact factor, unfortunately, in many parts of the world is king, and it's a disaster. So I would love the impact factor to go away tomorrow, but the reality is it's there, and for some countries, unfortunately, it's so dominant that if we didn't pay attention to it, people make choices about where they send their work based on.
Do you see any alternatives?
I think yes, based on personality, on the sort of things that we're interested in. People know that the Lancet is a journal that's interested in global health. It's interested in clinical trials. It's interested in public health. They know the sorts of political positions we take.
I was meaning more for academics. You know, is there other system of assessment?
In clinical medicine, we published a small report where it was done by one of our associate editors, did the study where he developed something called the clinical impact factor. So he took the top clinical medical journals and they're what the traditional impact factor, which is just such a weird, meaningless measure in so many ways, and then redid it, looking at how many of the articles published in the journal were actually cited in some of the points in, I think it was just up to date. So a point of care resource that's heavily used in the US, at least in clinical settings. And the rankings of the journals really changed.
Did you go up, Christine, at the Annals? I mean, that's the best.
Annals went up, but just an illustration of how strange the impact factor is. When our impact factor came out last year, which was the first year that included COVID papers, it more than doubled. And when my managing editor told me that, I'm like, they sent you the wrong journal. But it isn't.
Okay, we've got just 2 minutes left. I want to give everybody a chance to make just some final comment. Ashley, you're first. Anything you
no
should
pressure
have said that we've left unsaid?
No, I mean, I think we've covered so much. I really appreciate, again, going through a lot of the questions, the care that people are taking and asking them. There's a real, I think, push and support that's needed for open access. I think we still have a long way to go to ensure that everyone has easy access and reuse to all types of information. And I do hope that everyone's open for more experimentation and changing the systems is needed.
Christine.
I'll pass it over to Johan. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Well, Christine, last comments.
I mean, echoing a little bit what Ashley said, I think the important thing is that we're having these conversations, and that's how advances will be made. And I think the advances are made by people doing different experiments and seeing what happens and trying to move on. But I also agree with Richard. The biggest problem right now is not how you do peer review, but how do we get the good health science. At least my perspective, the lens I look through is through health and medicine. How do we get the good information implemented, and how do we reduce the harm that misinformation is currently doing?
Richard, a final word before I come to Johan.
Yeah, well, I would echo Christine. I don't think that open access is the biggest issue in my corner of the world. In fact, I think that the perverse effects of open access are now driving publishers to do extremely damaging things with the peer review system and publishing overall, and I'm very concerned about it. The biggest issue for me is definitely misinformation and what we do to curate a system to protect the trust and credibility of the science that we are supposed to be looking after.
Thanks. Johan, are you encouraging misinformation? A last word.
I don't encourage misinformation, but I think in order to restore the credibility of the system, we need research assessment reform. The system is driven, the system that Richard rightly condemns, which goes for volume, right? I mean, more and more papers, and more papers is what is rewarded. That is something that we should change. We should not reward authors or researchers for the volume of papers that they produce, but for the quality. And that is something that we can do also without an impact factor. This is also why Coalition S and Plan S do not use impact factors in order to assess researchers. We need to change the assessment system. And if we do that, these incentives for publishers to just produce volume will disappear, and we will be able to focus much more on the quality. That is what I think is at the root of the system.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is the bit I always find disappointing when you're doing something on Zoom. I mean, the good thing is we can, Ashley's in California, Christine's in Philadelphia, Johan is in some exotic place. I don't know what Richard presumably is in London. We can all come together, but the disappointing thing is we can't hug each other and have a clap and a drink afterwards. So thank you very much, all four of you, for a very lively discussion.